Hey guys, Pastor Ken here, and this is of course Atlas Hilaire, and we are really excited about a Zoom conversation that we're going to post on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel. So you guys can hear a conversation that Atlas really was kind of the facilitator of this, and it's about racism, and I think you're going to really like it, but I wanted him to have a chance to kind of introduce it before we show the actual Zoom panel.
Thanks, Pastor Ken. As Pastor Ken said, yes, this is a conversation that we decided to have because everybody knows about what's going on with response to the killing of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd. And there's a lot of unhealthy conversations going on across America. So we decided that maybe we should have a panel discussion or a forum where people can come together and have some healthy conversations, which will help to break down some walls where people can feel comfortable and safe. And we can really learn about each other as opposed to just pointing fingers and blaming one another. So I think it'll be a very interesting conversation and you'll enjoy it.
So this is something I call In My Shoes, a play on words to experience somebody else's perspective. And this all came about because I had a conversation with Pastor Ken from Calvary Baptist in Bellflower, and we had a conversation about 6 months ago in one of our board meetings to talk about what things could be addressed at our church that we probably weren't addressing at the moment. And one of the recommendations that I had was maybe we should have a platform or some panel discussion so that we could talk about the uncomfortable conversations, including racism, politics. And after that, a couple months ago, Pastor Ken contacted me again and mentioned that God had been tugging at his heart, especially after the Ahmaud Arbery incident in Georgia, and saying that, hey, maybe we need to follow up on this racism conversation. And then not too long after that, the unfortunate tragic accident, not accident, but the unfortunate tragic murder of George Floyd occurred. And Pastor Kim was like, you know what, we need to go ahead and move forward and have these conversations so that we can start addressing these topics that no one wants to talk about, no one wants to touch, even though there's an elephant in the room. And this evening, I have 3 panelists in our first conversation. I have Pastor Ken Goodband from Calvary Baptist Bellflower. We have Zachariah Chiney, who's a minister also at Calvary Baptist Bellflower. And then we have Norman Coulter, who's also a minister and founder of Six Man Leadership. I want to thank you all for joining me this evening for this conversation. And if I had to have a title for this, I would call it the issue of race. And I have to give full disclosure. Everyone keeps saying we need to have conversations. And this panel discussion tonight is not necessarily in the interest of having a conversation where two sides get to state their claim and state their side, and then we come to an agreement somewhere in the middle. This is more so to have some conversation to where a side gets to be heard, a side that feels like they haven't been heard, so that the other side could kind of experience or empathize with what another side is saying. And that side tonight just happens to be the African-American perspective and the unfair treatment in America and systemic racism. So I have the feeling of the way I equate it would be the same thing as if my 5-year-old daughter was to tell me that she's afraid of the dark, and every night when it's time for bed, I keep throwing her in her bedroom and saying, hey, don't worry about it. You're all right. Things are in place right now for you to overcome that. And don't give it any real credence or special consideration. So I'm not looking for the right answer. I'm not looking for anything politically correct. I don't need you to filter your answers. I just want you to come from the heart to have a discussion about the conversations or the questions that will be asked of you this evening. So with that being said, we're going to start off with Norman. I want you to describe your reality as a Black man in America. And this will be a 2-part question. You may address both without even hearing the second question, but describe your reality as a Black man in America, and how has society's portrayal of Black people in the media affected your everyday experience?
2 great questions, Dr. Hilaire. But the first one, I would just say that my reality as a Black man in America is evolved in some ways, because I think when you're growing up as a kid, at least my experience growing up was I was surrounded by a lot of homogeneity. You know, I was steeped in Black culture, inner city of Los Angeles, originally from Inglewood, but I spent 100% of my time around Blacks, you know, for a long time. Probably until I was scratching my ninth birthday, somewhere close to that, and things shifted. But if I had to say on the whole, speak to my reality as a Black man, I would say that it's always for me been a little conflicted, not about my identity. I was always very proud to be a black young man. I was infused with a lot of that. Um, probably to me, what I would say was a lot of pride that came out of the civil rights movement, having been born in the mid '70s, and my parents, or my mom namely, but I had parents who were from. My mom who was from the South, and I had grandparents who were from the South. You know, they were originally from Texas and Arkansas. So there was a lot of this sense of, I think, human agency of having come into a lot of autonomy, as a Black person moving west, recreating oneself. I think in California, it was powerful. Education, I think, was esteemed, and growing up, I was always kind of championed because I had an interest in kind of being an intellectual, even when I would use words that I didn't know what they meant, but people would pardon me for that. And they would, I just had a lot of encouragement, but and I had some non-examples. There were some people in my family, I think, who, some of my matriarchs and patriarchs wanted me to avoid that imagery. And so I felt like I always had kind of a counter narrative as a Black man growing up. As I was growing up, I was distinctly American, but it was made very clear to me that I had African roots. So my community took that very seriously and tried to teach me a lot about history that I wasn't learning in school, that I would later realize later on in my schooling, it was never going to be realized. Many of the things that I learned about my heritage came from my community, came from my church, came from just some of the community events that would occur. Is where you learn about Juneteenth, and you learn about just kind of who you are. But my reality also entailed a clash with culture when I realized that my homogeneity was not reflective of the world, and that I actually existed in a world that was dominated by whites, in the sense of the institutionalized forces, law enforcement, banking, housing industries, education. I was very naive to that as a 9-year-old. And when I was thrust into an integrated schooling system, because the schools in my neighborhood, my mom found out a program called Permit with Transportation, that was birthed out of some of the forced integration legislation that had occurred in the '70s, and it had erupted, and it had subsided by the time it came around to me. But in the '80s, the PWT program, as it was called, was optional, and my mom opted me into it. So I got bused from 48th and Avalon, what should have been a 45-minute drive. You know how it is in Southern California. We were able to stretch that out to about an hour and a half every morning. So I would take the RTD. Back in the day, we called it the rough, tough, and dangerous.
Rough and dangerous.
And I'd take the city bus to the school bus stop, try to grab a Winchell's donut on the way, and off I went to school. And but I encountered a lot of cultural diversity upon arrival to Woodland Hills, California, and that was probably where I was met with a different reality, where that's where my conflict kind of began, because then I was thrust into a learning curve. I guess maybe I was smart, maybe I wasn't, I don't know, but I had a lot of catching up to do academically, based on the rigor that they employed at the school I was attending. And I managed to catch up, but I had to depend on a white instructor. I had never had to do that before. I was looked at funny. If I brushed my hair, people asked me why I was brushing my hair. They'd never seen a boar's hair brush before. They didn't know what waves were. They didn't listen to rap music. I mean, it was an absolute cultural 180-degree collision, man. And some of it was cool, but honestly, it really set the stage for me understanding that my culture was actually an unknown culture. For as much as I was familiar with what it meant to be Black, so many people had no idea. So for me, I think growing up, that was part of it. As a man, and I'll try to segue to speed this up, into your second question, Brother Atlas. I think I came to understand that the remoteness with which people kind of base their opinions, or the remoteness on which people base their opinions, was largely because of media presentations of black Americans, namely males. And a lot of it coming out of the 80s was violent. Los Angeles had had a very prominent reputation for its gang reality in the 80s, even though that wasn't really how I defined all of the space in the inner city. That seemed to be the imagery coming through the news. So um, crack cocaine, Crips, Bloods, warfare, Uzis, all of these things were kind of this, there was kind of this looming archetypal perception of black men that I think that by the time I got to high school and was no longer attending school in the LA Unified School District, it was still, the imprint had been made already. I had been exposed to the lowered expectations that I felt people had for me. It was like there was a separate standard for me. Um, and it ranged between pity and disqualification, and neither one of those I think is operational. Ideally, I don't think that's what we want for our kids, but that's what I experienced. And then as I became an adult and there was less people kind of rooting for you, as you grow up and you have to make a living and move into the space of your reality, you start realizing that people's biases have a lot of power, and how you get employed, the things that you're able to purchase, you're buying, your where you can live, and it's the 90s into the 2000s, and it's still, you're realizing that a lot of the victories we thought maybe people thought were won in the 60s at the tail end of the civil rights movement weren't actually victories of conscience. They were maybe victories of legislation, and certainly not victories necessarily in the spiritual space. So so for me, I mean, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but that was kind of my reality. And not a lot has changed. I think a lot of where I am now as a black man, how I'm perceived, I think usually depends on the opportunity that I get to be in relationship with people. I think when I have a relationship, then people get to know me. But I think when I don't, then a lot of the same forces are still at work, unfortunately.
Pastor Ken, what do you think is the obstacle with society acknowledging that African Americans have been treated unfairly because of their skin color?
Well, I'm just listening to, you guys talking about kind of how you grew up, and obviously that wasn't necessarily my upbringing. I grew up kind of broken home, very kind of unstable home life, and just grew up, moving around a lot. So a lot of different neighborhoods and stuff. But I think for me, there's just, as a human being, I got a lot of blind spots. I don't see things that I don't want to see, kind of that denial of, and until someone points it out to me, I don't want to see it. So I can't see it. You don't know what you don't know, kind of a thing. So, for me, it's like, it doesn't really happen to me, so it must not happen to anybody else almost. Like, that can't be true. Like, that doesn't really happen nowadays. Like, yeah, I get it. It happened, there was, we're talking, years ago, or I've watched movies and I'm like, yeah, that's horrible, but that's not really the reality of today. And then you see something like with George Floyd and you're like, I think, my typical response, just for me, I'm just saying for me, is that's horrible. Like, that's horrendous. I mean, that should never happen. But I wonder what really happened behind the scene. Like, I don't really know all the facts. I didn't see the whole thing. So it's almost like in my mind, I want to begin to rationalize why that can't really be racism, and especially that there's that kind of hatred for a white man to have for a black man. Like that just can't, it's like that, I don't, it's like, I don't want that to be true. So therefore it's kind of this, I'm going to rationalize that away. And I think that's kind of my own excuse for keeping that blind spot like right in front of my eyes, and to then actually have conversations like Norman's talking about, actually sit down and talk to someone and get the reality of what's really happening, and just go, wow, like, wow, I don't even know. And it's kind of that, I don't know what to say about that. Like how it just blows my mind, like to think of that. So I think there's just kind of that, I see a commercial on TV where there's a child dying of starvation in some other country. Man, I want to flip to a different channel. I don't want to watch that. And it's kind of like that, where I see this stuff and it's just the ugliness, the underbelly, the ugliness of our society, and go, yeah, I don't want to deal with that. I don't want to have to watch that, or, maybe too quickly just kind of, I don't want to deal with that part of it and like sweep it under the rug, like switch the channel. Like, let's talk about something else. And even like you said, Atlas, I mean, we've talked about, man, yeah, we should have these conversations. Yeah, let's put that on the to-do list. But it's not like, no, we need to have these conversations. And so right now, I think just that, like, eye-opening again, like, hey, let's quit talking about it and let's talk about it. And then do something about what we talk about. So I think that's I mean, at least from my perspective, it's just more of a, I don't really want to see it and I don't want to believe it. And therefore, I'm not sure it's actually happening, when the reality is, yeah, it is. So, yeah.
I think it's safe to say that racism and unfair treatment is not necessarily the root of the problem, but one of America's symptoms when we talk about the race problem, or just problems in general. Pastor Zachariah, what do you think is keeping us from getting to the root of the problem? And why do you think these symptoms continue to fester even within the church walls?
Let me begin by saying that I have a totally different experience. I am continental African, and by that I go down to the specifics that I am Nigerian. Just thinking about why conversations about race relations or racism is difficult or uncomfortable is I'm thinking about a number of reasons. One could be that our minds are already made up, like the politicians who say, his mind is already made up, he doesn't want to be disturbed with the facts. Now, a conversation about race is going to bring out facts that will confront us. Another reason could be that for most people, they don't even see the need for it, because as far as they're concerned, what are you guys talking about? And then there is the place of history, whether it is the history of slavery years ago, or the freeing of the slaves 160 years ago. And people say, I mean, how can you guys be talking? This is 160 years ago. Or you can even talk about the civil rights movement and say, hey, we're talking about another 60 years ago. So what are you guys complaining about? I mean, whether it's rise up, whether it's rise up, I mean, whether it's the allegations of playing victimhood, something that I hope I can come back to later on. But the reality of conversation about race is that it has to do with exposing our hidden bias and our prejudice and the assumptions that we have about other people. Now, our boys are helping us. Before we moved to California, when we were in Chicago, when we get talking about something, oh, these Americans are all like this. These Americans are all like this. And then and the boy said, how many Americans have you met? How can you say all Americans when you've not met even a fraction? I mean, what you've met, the number of Americans you've met, it's, I don't even know how to say in terms of quantifying it. Just a few experiences to make a sweeping generalization about a whole people, a whole nation. And sometimes conversations about race is like that. Maybe I have had an experience with a person of the other color that I didn't like. And so I generalize and say they're all like this. It exposes the inadequacies, if you want, the disconnect between the ideals of the Emancipation Proclamation and the reality of the African American experience on ground. I mean, the experience is far from it. Now, again, I hear people have said, I mean, I was listening to the Attorney General talking about how there's been so much improvement over the years. And I'm saying, okay, I won't be the one to make that kind of statement. I mean, if I am within a position of power and privilege, I will allow the person who feels marginalized, the person who is on the fringes of society, to be the one to say, we've made progress. Because it's easier for me on the outside to say, oh, now you guys can vote, now you guys can drive, now you get, but is that all there is? Is that all there is to it? Let the person be the one to say, you know, there's been so much progress. The last thing I want to say on this is I feel like the reason conversations about race makes us uncomfortable is that with the exposure, with the awareness, with the knowledge, there is a responsibility that comes with it. Now, what are you going to do about it? So we don't want to be the ones to have to start advocating, or to be the ones, now that we know that this truly is the experience of the Black man in America, what are we going to do? Whether it's as, I mean, it is as a community or as a church or as an individual or even as a family, there is a responsibility that comes with it. And hey, we already have too many responsibilities, I think. We don't want to be bothered with more.
Now, the next couple of questions are loaded questions. With that said, I'm going to ask them so that we can get a glimpse into two opposite sides of the spectrum. And before I go into that, when I mention Black Lives Matter, I'm not talking about the organization. I'm talking about the statement, Black Lives Matter. But feel free to touch on any part of that you would like to. Pastor Ken, can you explain how the mantra, hearing the mantra Black Lives Matter, could be offensive to someone who's not Black?
Oh, that is a loaded question. Yeah. So I remember first hearing about, the first kind of in 2012, 2013, with the Trayvon Martin killing, that kind of came out. That's when it came to the forefront for me. And as a pastor at our church, people, bringing that up and talking about it. And I just remember that first weekend that it really came out, feeling like, I probably need to say something about this. We want to make sure that we're, as a church, we're connected to our community and communicating what's kind of going on. We pray for people and the situations and all over the country and those kinds of things. So, but my response to it was, well, all lives, we understand here that all lives matter. And I, kind of going back to that first question of, hey, I want to get away from the pain of it as quickly as possible, and kind of say, well, this is the church's stand on that. This is our church kind of all lives matter. You know, Jesus, we're all created in the image of God. Jesus came to save everyone. So in saying that, it was my way of saying, you know, it really, to me, it doesn't matter if you're Black or if you're, you know, Hispanic or, you know, Asian, white, doesn't matter. It's all lives matter. And so I almost felt like when that first came out, kind of just to be honest, it actually felt like a racial statement. Like I wouldn't say, hey, all white lives matter. I just, it's just like all lives matter. That's what I think. That's what I feel. And so I kind of felt like that's what we need to say. Like, hey, yes, we agree with you, and we agree that all lives matter. I've since rethought that, and I know we're going to kind of talk a little bit more about it, but my response to that, you know, was a way of not really acknowledging the pain in Black lives. And yeah, I'm with you, Atlas. I'm not for really for the organization of Black Lives Matter. But I do love the content of that statement, Black Lives Matter. And a friend of mine, you know, kind of reiterated to me, hey, if you're doing a run, a 5K to raise money for cancer, you're not saying that diabetes doesn't matter. You're just focusing your attention on this issue. And you're not saying there aren't other issues or other issues aren't as important. So, but when you say, yeah, but all lives matter, you're kind of saying, hey, well, don't forget about diabetes or all the other whatever out there. But it's like, no, this is the focus. We need to focus on this right now. This is a huge issue. And so, you know, quit saying all lives matter. It's like, but just acknowledge that Black Lives Matter. So, again, I don't want it to be true, racism. And so I didn't want to really acknowledge the pain of that. But I think as I'm growing and as I'm learning, I want to stay humble and listen. It's like, I need to pay attention to how I respond to those kinds of things. And as I've thought about that question, Atlas, I think really the most disturbing thing to me about the mantra, Black Lives Matter, is that we have to say that. Like, that's what disturbs me. Like, that we actually have to say that. Like, why are we still having to say that? Black lives do matter, but we have to say it because our African American community does not feel like they matter. It's like, wow. And I just, you know, so I think that's the more disturbing part of it for me, is that we actually have to say it, and it does matter. So I don't know if that answers the whole question, but that's kind of my thought on it.
Perfectly. So on the exact opposite side of that, Norman, I want you to describe how it feels or how it affects someone when someone says Black Lives Matter, and then the immediate response is, well, all lives matter. Or when the topic of America's dark history regarding slavery comes up and people give you the sigh and, man, we still talking about that? That was over however many years ago. How does that affect you? You're still on mute.
Yeah. Okay, sorry about that. I try to mute myself so I don't make sounds when people are talking. But no, you know, there's just an indignity. I think when kids are small, you know, one of the things that my son says to me, even now, he's almost 6, and he'll say, "But Daddy, you're not listening to me. You're not listening to me." And sometimes, honestly, I'm like, I wasn't trying to listen to you, man. Here's what's about to happen. I'm about to break it down for you, son. I don't want to hear your opinion, you know. But I've learned, you know, I flash back in those moments with my son to when I was 6, and how deafening it felt for somebody not to hear me. Even if what was going to come down was my mom was going to issue some type of a punishment, or I was going to have to endure missing out on something, you know, I still wanted to be heard. And I sit down with him now, and I find myself talking to Langston, and I'll say, "Hey, man, I want to apologize for not listening to you. You know, I mean, I'm not saying I always do this, but I try to have the presence to give him the dignity of a conversation, because sometimes I just get it wrong. You know, sometimes I've interpreted the situation completely incorrectly. Sometimes I'm accusing him of something that he wasn't doing. Sometimes he has a really good rationale. Sometimes he doesn't. But when people say all lives matter as a response to, say, me making the statement that Black lives matter, or they're just responding generally to that, it kind of is back to the analogy of cancer that you gave, Pastor Ken. You know, it's like, well, all cancers matter. Well, I look at it kind of like certain types of like diabetes. You know, if there's childhood obesity among poor kids in my neighborhood, and a lot of them are getting type 2, or kids are being born type 1 diabetic, then I care about diabetes. You know, that's the triage in my neighborhood. And I think that for me, when somebody is so dismissive very quickly about, I'll mention the slavery part in a second, but when they say all lives matter, I know they haven't investigated. I know they haven't thought deeply about the pain. They've already moved to a place of exoneration because the last thing they want to feel is guilty. And they may not be doing, I think that's instinctive. I think that most of us, if you say something that's connected to me and it sounds bad, like if a woman says, man, the misogyny in the church, or the patriarchal abuse of a community, and I get defensive because I'm a man, if I go to that place first, then I know that I'm probably trying to absolve myself very quickly, because I don't want to be associated with the harm. I don't want to be accused of being a conduit of pain for anybody. So usually what I do now is, like, you know, my response, or not my response, but the way I feel is, my initial feeling is I feel disregarded. But I've come to evolve, because I've been dealing with this so much lately, is to try to put my shoes on the other foot, and I go, people are being read in to a racist reality that has been native to me, but not to them. These are, you know, for a lot of whites, I think they're imports to this reality. And as unfathomable as it may be for me to see that people have not had an adequate understanding, I try to go there so that I can walk them. I try to hear them out. I'm saying, well, wait a minute, you know, before you discount what I'm saying, or what you hear people saying when they say Black lives matter, do you understand how Black people feel about the taking of Black life in this country, or how Black life has been impacted by incarceration, or how disproportionate, you know, how racial discrimination in the spaces of education, housing, medical care, so forth and so on. Have you ever thought about these realities? Well, and honestly, that's when I realized that's the gap. You know, when I hear the notion of slavery being kind of distanced, and it's like, yeah, but that was a long time ago. I mean, again, I feel disregarded, you know, but I also have come to feel like it's an opportunity, because in those moments I say, well, you know, I can be kind of prophet-like in this space, and I can speak the truth, and we'll see how it lands, you know, because for anyone to say that, man, slavery is so long ago, what's that got to do with you? I've literally heard Black men in barbershops say that. I've heard Morgan Freeman say that. You know, I've heard, and I feel the same way no matter who's saying it, which is either you don't understand it, or you don't understand the implications, because they no longer really apply. In the case of certain types of Black people, I think sometimes they've been able to transcend the effects of certain things. So they think, if I did it, anybody can do it. Oversimplification, but I think sometimes that's the landscape. When whites say it, I know that they have not considered certain things. They've not considered what it means to not be able to hand a better life down to your children for 12 and a half to arguably 20 generations. To not be able to say, I'm guaranteeing to the best of my ability that my children have a better education than I did, better job opportunities, better housing, better medical care, better life expectancy. You know, to not be able to promise that because people literally treat you, you know, like you don't belong. They sell your offspring. When that happens perpetually for generation after generation, and then people kind of cast off slavery, I know that they don't understand it. And I know they can't identify with it, not in its modern iteration. And again, I think the movement is automatically, I sense that the movement is to a place of trying to, well, wait a minute, we're not that bad, are we? You know what I mean? America's a pretty good place. Not the same conversation. Not the same conversation. There is no indictment in recognizing history. I think, as Pastor Chine said, you know, it's when you're dealing in this exploration, you're dealing in fact. You're dealing in something objective. Then you can move to the implications. Then you can properly kind of investigate the heart and the space of another human being, which is highly empathic, as you were saying, Pastor Ken. You know, so it's kind of like, it's this, for me initially. I'm not shocked, but it's hurtful. But then I've come to see it as an opportunity, and I'm like, well, we're gonna see how this lands, because I'm not gonna, you know, they say the opportunity of a lifetime is good for the lifetime of the opportunity. So I'm gonna take it. And I've been trying to step into that space.
Recently in New York, a woman called the police accusing a black man of threatening her. And in her threat to the man, before she made the phone call, she told him, I'm going to call the police and tell them that a black man is threatening me. She made the phone call and turned on the theatrics. A black man is threatening me. He's harassing me, and hurry, come right now, come right now. How does knowing that just your color of your skin is weaponized, how does that impact your day-to-day life? Pastor Chene and Norm, you can both chime in on that.
I think I would say that it's not just the weaponization of blackness, but also the demonization of it. And again, some of these things actually predate us, right? You can go back to Plato, to Aristotle, and some of those people that we don't have the time for. And to be black, I mean, when the gospel, for instance, was brought to us, I mean, white and whiteness was a symbol of the good, and blackness, of course, of the bad and evil. And so anything black is associated with evil, and of course, my skin is black. At least people say it's black. But some of these things make it very difficult for a black person to be able to live life, just a normal life. Now, as a black father of black boys, of course, I mean, imagine that every day the conversation you're having with your boys is, okay, when you go out, I want you to be home at this point. And these are boys they are boys in their own right. You're telling them, I want you to be home at this point because I don't want to hear any stories. You're telling them, hey, you can't make your hair that way because it makes you a soft target for law enforcement. I mean, people have, there are associations that they make with a person who dresses this way or who makes his hair this way. And so constantly is the burden. Now, excuse me. Okay, I see, sorry, my battery is low. Wow.
All good.
Yeah, and so, oh, Lord have mercy on me. I really apologize. I didn't realize this. Okay, I was saying that I feel like there is both weaponization and demonization of blackness, in the sense that, I mean, it's almost like I'll have to prove my worth for just about anything. I'll have to make a statement. I'll have to prove to you that, hey, I'm here in the store to buy something. I'm not going to steal. I'm not going to steal anything. I'll have to prove to you that my grades, I actually worked for it. I have to prove to you that even the course I am reading, I am reading it because I can do it. The first time, 2005, when I came to the US for graduate studies, the course that I was doing, my scholarship body came to me and said, why don't you change to another one? I said, why? And the statement was, well, we don't think that, do you think people in Africa need systematic and historical theology? And I said, why not? And I was told, oh, we thought you could do spiritual formation or do missions. But I understand where that is coming from. It's coming from the thinking that we are not capable of engaging in deep intellectual thinking. And so let me do something that is more practical rather than something that is more intellectually engaging. Which I felt that, I mean, was disrespectful. But again, it's the burden on my part, is the burden of just knowing, hey, this is going to be with me for as long as I live. I'm not looking forward to dropping this blackness and embracing any other, because this is how God made me. And besides, I grew up in the days of black is beautiful. And so, but the more I think about it, I don't know if I'll have another opportunity, but the more I think about this, the more I think about a response that I was supposed to have given, the role of the church in all of this. The church should be a place where we recognize difference and we celebrate difference. The church should be a place where we don't conceal difference. The other time we were having some conversation with Pastor Ken, and I said, you know, I think we try to homogenize, and we forget that there is a difference between harmonization and homogenization. Now, God brought us all together so he can create this harmony of difference. And the church should be that place where that kind of conversation should be taking place. And the other thing I also wanted to say is, the more I think about it, again, thinking about the church, there is an intentionality that comes with being the church, that we're going to be very intentional about being the church where people of all colors can come here and they will truly feel at home. And that is going to affect so many things down from our programs on Sunday to the very life of the church itself, that we are so intentional about it. Let me pause here with the hope that I'll get to say something before we close.
I think that when you speak of the weaponizing, I like the way Pastor Chine discussed that, you know, of weaponization, but also a demonization. You know, for me, I don't know that I think about the weaponization as much as I probably think about that second part. I understand, I think it's kind of more like ingrained in me at this point, that I understand that there are certain rules I unfortunately have to live by as a Black man in this country. But I have visited other countries where I've been told, if you lived here, some of those same rules would apply. You'd have to be vigilant and aware that there are anti-Black sentiments, you know, that in various pockets of said societies, and be from, you know, I've done basketball camps overseas, and I've had kids from the Ukraine, and they tell me about what life is like in Ukraine, and they say, yeah, it'd be a tough place for you, you know. I think for me though, I always kind of come back to the irony of that, you know, that the imperialist has successfully systemized this kind of reverse this mythology that paints me as the villain because of the color of my skin. It's amazing to me that I even in my own mind growing up, when I thought American, I didn't think of myself. When G.I. Joe used to sing about a real American hero, I remember going to Toys R Us with my mom, and I was going to buy a white G.I. Joe figure because one of the main characters was white, and the cartoon was really popular in the mid '80s. And I remember she looked over, she grabbed this other one. It was a black guy. I think the character's name was Roadblock. He had a bald head, real menacing looking dude. And Roadblock was cool, but he wasn't one of the main characters. And my mom said, why don't you get this one? This is a real American hero. And I remember thinking, she was just trying to champion the black imagery, you know, and I found myself, you know, I did that when I took Langston to Knott's Berry Farm the first time. I bought Franklin, you know, I bought the stuffed character Franklin because he was the only black character in the show. And I was like, I have to be intentional about the models because of that weaponization and that demonization that I see in our society, and the vacuum or the silence or the absence. You know, it begs to be filled, but it's probably not going to be filled incidentally. So I have to find a way to do that. I have to educate my stepdaughters and my son, you know, about people of color who are incredibly contributory to this nation's existence and to the worldscape. And so I think that's one of the ways that it's affected me, you know, is that I have taken that upon myself, and I understand that that's not really an expectation that I can put on the world. I can champion it, and I can invite people into that space. But in my class, there are certain books I don't teach. I don't teach Lord of the Flies, and I don't teach The Great Gatsby to juniors, not because those are bad books, although I do have my feel of like dystopian literature. I don't like to teach about the world only falling apart. I like to teach about things that are integrative. So, you know, for my juniors, you know, I know that they are, I don't teach a demographic of students that would necessarily know A Raisin in the Sun or A Dream Deferred by Langston Hughes. So I'll teach that play by Lorraine Hansberry, and I'll have them move into understanding Walter Lee Younger, who's the main character. He's mid-30s. He's been denied opportunities all of his life. He's thirsty for an opportunity to excel and just provide a better life for his son, because he doesn't want Travis to his only memory of his life to be, well, I grew up in a tenement in Chicago, and I slept on the couch, you know, while I was growing up, because my dad, the best job he could get was as a chauffeur, you know. So I teach my students that book. We can still analyze the literature. We can still do all of the English things, but we're going to use that lens so that we can bring them into that space, because I understand that weaponization and that demonization has filtered into a dehumanization of blacks, and that's a fact. So the line of humanity, you know, is always above. If this is the line and humanity is above it and subhuman and non-human are below it, racism will always put, you know, if racism is successful, and I use that term loosely, then it's going to put certain people groups below that line. And those people don't get the privileges. Those people get the non-preferential treatment. The things that should be no-brainers, like rights in this country, end up being truncated at best and absent at worst, because we forced people who were born on this soil to fight for their rights. It doesn't make sense. It's the most counter ideal reality you could possibly present, and yet people fight about this. They fight in rhetoric on Facebook about this. And I pause everybody and I say, if you're in the overrepresented group, hear me for a second. I come in peace, right? I'm just asking you a simple question. Should citizens have had to fight for their rights? It's not like America came to its senses one day and fixed this. They didn't fix it. It was a bloodbath in the 60s. They even killed a president, and one who was probably going to be, he was definitely going to be, he was the candidate. And they killed two brothers because of their alignment. This country was not playing around. So when we present this reality, again, we're not dealing in the subjective. And I'm not pointing fingers, because unlike like in South Africa, like there's a great documentary, I get a lot of encouragement from the Truth and the Truth Commission, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, led, by all those great leaders, and Desmond Tutu being at the center of that, and Nelson Mandela. But we don't have the slave owners here today. We don't have many of the arbiters of racism. Bull Connor's gone, so all we have is the descendancy. And together, this is where that harmonization comes into play. But the weaponization and the demonization of blacks is always perplexing to me, because what I see is a failure to submit to truth. I see a gross lack of a desire for repentance. And repentance, by the way, is while we do tend to use it in Christian theology, we know that it's powerful in the space of humanity in general. The notion of being able to own your part, even if it was handed down to you like a baton in a relay race, it's still incumbent upon us to fight for the solutions. One leader said about South Africa, he said when they were on the verge of civil war, Nelson Mandela said, the fact of the matter is this: if we war and one group vanquishes the other group, ashes will be left. And you and I will meet again, and we'll have to talk about the ashes. And I feel like that's where America is. When I think about the weaponization of my color, yes, I think it's ironic, because as somebody whose group holds none of the power institutionally in this country, how is it that we're hyper-villainized? I don't understand that. I don't understand this. I do understand it in the sense of propagandizing this, you a shadow monster of black men. I understand that in the way that Hitler successfully used the same tactics, because you had to dehumanize people in order for people to stomach the mistreatment. But when we get lost on that, and now we change the subject to so many other political things, or when clergymen ignored Dr. King's plight and they criticized him for being the leader of the movement, and he wrote to them from Birmingham jail, I never could understand how that became the mainstay, when the reality was that there was a true demonic presence in this country of supremacy, and that is a principality that has to be broken. That is that's job one. That's job one, is to address things that are counterintuitive to the heart of God about humanity. I think that you hit this thing where it lives, and you begin to go to war with the right things. And so for me, it's broadened out into that for me. I don't just think about how the weaponization of my blackness impacts me as a man or my son. I stood holding him, cutting his umbilical cord, realizing that people wanted him dead and they had never even met my son, but they would sooner toss him up into the air and shoot him with a gun than see him thrive in this world. And I remember crying tears in that delivery room, because I couldn't understand how the heart of any human being could be so evil toward anyone. And I made a decision then. I named him Langston because his name has an iteration that means rescued and rescuer. And I wanted him to be a rescuer. I wanted him to be somebody that God would protect, but I wanted him to be somebody that would also have a heart for the plight of others. And so I think for me, it's been a humbling reality for something that I can't change to be weaponized against me. But I've been confident in that God has shown me that this, in fact, is not the way He created us. So there is truth and good in all of us, and I try to appeal to that, and I try to keep that in mind when I feel that weaponization coming into fruition. In the moments that it does. Some days are easier than others.
Pastor Ken, I wanted to know, from your perspective, your idea, what do you think is the church's role in racial reconciliation?
Well, I think just like conversations we've had a little bit, when I think of this, and we're going through the book of James right now in our church, and it is so like right on with a lot of stuff we're walking through. community-wise and country-wise. But we obviously the church's role. I mean, we're on mission to connect people in a relationship with God that is real and genuine and definitely makes a difference in their life. And that difference isn't just what you do on Sunday morning. It's what you do in your life. So we say, love God, love others, change the world. It's basically that it actually makes you, and I was talking to our staff today about this, like this relationship with God is a personal relationship that changes you from the inside out. And therefore you actually begin to walk in his presence and live out that presence in your relationship. So this godly character comes out. So that, I mean, that's all that part of it. So when you think of racism, I mean, it's sin. It's like ugly. It needs to be taken care of. And we have, of course, the answer in Jesus Christ, that personal relationship with Christ, the one who comes in and breaks down the wall, the one who brings together those two groups, the Ephesians, the Jews and the Gentiles brought together, two opposites brought together. I always say, man, when God's involved, there's reconciliation. When God's in the middle, there's reconciliation. He's the restorer. He's the reconciler. So anything that's pushing us away, you talking about the weaponization, the demonization, I agree with that. That is like totally, it's satanic. Anything that has to do with that. So obviously we're like, yeah, we want to be about bringing people into a relationship with God that brings us together with others, all that. But I heard something the other day that really like hit a chord with me. It was an African-American pastor talking, and he said to a group of us white pastors, he said, hey, guys, I don't want to just be invited to the table. I want to help build the table. And it was just like, whoa, like that really hit me. I don't know why that hit such a chord for me, but I just, our role is that, when I think about heaven, it's every tribe, every nation, every tongue, it's multi-color. God is creative, just amazing. You look at the world, just amazing, brilliant colors. And so multi-colorful, multinational, all that, but I was thinking about this too, that, I mean, my heart for our church is to be a church that mirrors heaven in that way. But I also want our church in that to mirror our community. So when you come into our church, you see community with our community. And I just, that's the way it should be for me. So I think that I remember hearing a guy say that you don't have to know all the answers. You just have to have all the right people in the room. And if you have the right people in the room, you're going to come up with the answers together, and you're going to move forward. And so I love it that at our church, I get to hang out with you two guys, Atlas and Pastor Zachariah. We need to get Norman to come over to Calvary, but we just that I really feel like we are getting some traction on like really working together, and I think that's important for me. Like it's not just, oh, I need you guys at the table. No, I need you guys at the table because we got to build this thing together. And I can't see everything. Like, again, I said at the beginning, I got a lot of blind spots, but to have the right people and then working together, like really strategizing, collaborating together so that we're actually reaching out to a community that is, colorful, and that's awesome. And so I used to say this, it was kind of a dumb thing, but I thought it was, the right thing to say. I don't see color. I don't see color. That means I'm not a racist. I don't see color. And now I'm like, I need to see color. God made you colorful. God made this colorful. So it's like, we don't want to be color blind, we want to see. And I just want to say this, like when Zachariah started coming to our church, he said, we had a conversation, Zachariah, and it was something like this. You and your wife Salamatu would refer to my wife as, you would say, how's the pastor's wife? And I would say, you mean Dawn? That's my wife. And you would both be like, and so I had that conversation with you one day where I said, hey, I don't want to be disrespectful of your culture, but like when you hear people at this church, because I grew up here, you're going to hear them call me Kenny, Ken, Pastor Ken, Pastor, and whatever you hear them call me like that, if you hear them call me anything else, you need to let me know. But if those four things, that tells you how long they've known me, because I grew up at the church. So people that have known me for a long time call me Kenny. And I didn't want that to for you to I didn't want that to sound disrespectful to you. That just meant they've known me for a long time. And other people call me Pastor Ken. They haven't known me as long, and they have maybe a little higher level of that respect. You need to call someone, in that fashion. So I said, I want to be respectful to you, but to me, it's fine if you call my wife Dawn, or if Salamatu calls, and you said, well, we want to keep that respect level with our boys. So how about if we call her Mama Dawn? And of course, that's her favorite name because she's a grandma and she loves Mama Dawn. So I was like, that would be perfect. But it was just kind of this understanding that it's okay that we're different, because God brings us together as one body in Christ. And to have the conversations that we're actually understanding different culture and, race and all those things, and the beauty of it, that's the kind of church I want to have and be involved in. And I know I'm kind of going off on this, but when I came back to Calvary, we have a big recovery ministry, and a few of the leaders, they were interviewing me, and they said, we don't like it that our church has become known as a recovery church in this community. We're known as a recovery church. And I said, what other kind is there? I said, because the church you're talking about, I don't want to go to that church. We're all in recovery. Okay, so if you don't think that, you're in denial, and we have a group for you. Okay, so, but, it's just this, man, our role, our mission is to make disciples of Jesus, fully devoted followers, and that's building heaven, every tribe, every nation, every tongue. That's why when we talk about missions, it's locally, globally, it's all over the planet. So I know we need to be more intentional about making that happen, like really making that happen. And that's what I love about these kinds of conversations is, okay, how do we actually make that intentional? And having you guys, and now Norman, I feel like, man, you're like an ally where I could contact you and say, hey man, come and speak to us about kind of what are some things you see and what we do. So collaboration is a huge part of it.
Absolutely.
I want to thank you all for taking the time. I know this is family time. My family is probably waiting in the wings, but you guys have brilliant minds, and I appreciate your time, and thank you so much for participating.
Thank you, Atlas.
Thank you, Atlas, for
Pastor
putting it
Ken,
together.
Pastor Chene, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you,
Glad
guys.
we did it again.
Yeah. Thank you.